thank you very much. So it's my pleasure to be here. And today I will tell you about my own research that I've done at Adobe Research. So it's about photography. And first, let me show you a few examples that motivate my work. So here's a picture I took in London. And that's what the camera, so I think, yeah, you see there. So it was much nicer than that. That's what the camera gives out of the, just I download the picture from your camera, I see that. But I spend a bit of time to retouch it, and I get that. And that's, that works pretty well on that screen. So I think we can all agree it's better. I'm not a professional, but it's already an improvement. A professional would have taken a better picture, done a better job, but I think that shows that. Here's another picture. There, again, that's what the camera gave, but I can guarantee it was so much nicer when I was there. Actually, it was a lot more like that. And after I retouch, I can bring out the details, the colors, much more, represent how I felt and this kind of amazing landscape I had the chance to be at some point. So let's look a bit how people used to retouch photos, because most of the photos we see in magazines or in presentation have been retouched. So in the past, they were done with, in a dark room. And I suspect several of you in the room have done darkroom printing. I don't know who I see, people I know who say yes. So who has tried darkroom printing? You should try. It's a lot of fun. So if you try, it's fun, but there's a big challenge. Is that any error is a failure. We have to trash it, restart from scratch. It's in the dark, of course, with a red light. We have to move the hands. There's some chemicals. Don't mix the chemicals, it doesn't work. But it's rewarding. You can say, I've done it. That's my picture. But now, it's still going on these days, but people have switched to software. And I work for Adobe, so we use Photoshop, but a lot of people use Photoshop. Photoshop is great, and I would say probably the most powerful feature, or one of the most powerful features of Photoshop is undo. If there's an error, we can just go back one step and do it again. We don't have to trash the result and do it all over again. And if you have used Photoshop, you know that screenshot I show you here as nothing special. It's a very standard view of Photoshop that we have to face. And Photoshop is very powerful. It makes our life easier. But I would argue that we can do even better than that. We can do easier. So, here's a brief statement of what I'd like to do. There's this observation that photos, to get the best out of them, most of them need to be retouched. But this process could be easier. And that's the motivation of my research. And I base the work I'm going to show you on a few observations. Retouching is not easy, but there are people who know how to do that out there. There are professionals and artists who have been trained, and they're really good at doing it. So it's possible. There are also, if we go on the web, there's a lot of examples of great photos. Like photos are not good out of a camera most of the time, but there are a lot of examples that we can use in some form there. So the strategies that I propose is, can we take some example of good photos and extract some form of statistics that what makes them good and make it happen on normal photos like mine I have shown you? And can we use that also, for instance, for machine learning? That's, and there's hope because people know how to do it and we have data out there. So the first attempt I did at that problem was when I started my postdoc. And we have this simple problem statement, is to take the pictures that you see, a kind of casual, normal picture and make it look like an artist picture that you see at the bottom corner. And before we went and to write an algorithm, we look at a lot of artist pictures, and we mostly work with black and white pictures and try to understand what was special about them. And we identify a couple of important characteristics there. The first one is what we call global contrast. So for instance, global contrast is if we see the picture on the left, that notion that this artist, Ansel Adams, he tend to use in his pictures this kind of tension between a very dark region and a very bright region. And that kind of shapes the picture, and there's something distinguished, very special about that. On the other hand, there's some artists who go all the other ways. They remove this notion of global contrast. So if you see Kenro Izu on the right, he has this fully uniform thing. It's almost all gray there. There's a lot of things going on, but there's not this tension in his picture. So that's the first thing we want to be able to somehow understand and manipulate, this notion of global contrast. Then we also identify what we call local contrast. So local contrast, you can think of it as the texture, the details in the picture. And again, Ansel Adams creates a tension between regions that are smooth. So here, for instance, the cloud in the sky, and regions are very detailed. You know, this snow over the trees has a lot of texture, and it's very characteristic of his style there. On the opposite, Kenro-Izu has this kind of detail everywhere, so much so that when we work on this project and we contacted the photographer, say, can we reproduce your work? He said, please make sure to tell people that I do spend a lot of work to reproduce the details, and he has his own printing technique just to get all the details. So he really cares about it. This is how he himself characterizes his style. Very detailed, but it's very detailed everywhere. There's not this tension of smooth and detail. So we use these two ideas, global and local contrast, and we propose a pipeline. And I won't go into too much detail of that pipeline, but that pipeline is fairly simple in principle. We take an image, we do an explicit decomposition into a component that captures a global contrast, the big region that are bright and dark, and another component that we call the local contrast that captures the texture of the image. We transfer the statistics of both, and basically we transfer the histogram of the values in both. We get two new layers, we recombine them, then we do a bit of polishing that I won't discuss today, and we get the result. So before showing you how it looks, I want to show you that this decomposition at the beginning is really important. The rest is somehow fairly straightforward, but having a good decomposition is key. So here's a simple way to decompose an image into global contrast and local contrast. I can just blur it. And it, to a first approximation, it does it. Like the blurry region has these shadow and highlight regions that are very clear there. And if we look at the high frequency residual, it has a texture there, so it does the decomposition we're looking for. The problem is that if you look, the edges are blurred, and there's some halos that appear. And if anyone has experience with image processing, when we have halo and blurs, they tend to be like a sticky paper. Like if they appear, they're going to be there all the time. It's very hard to fix once they're there. So instead of that, we use almost the same decomposition, which is a blur that doesn't cross edges, and that there's many options to do that. We use a bilateral filter, which is really a blur, but the kernel is truncated at edges, and we get almost the same decomposition, but now the edges are sharp, and there's no halos in the texture. So with that decomposition, we can get result, and I'll go back a bit later to show you how important that is. So here's a picture I've shown you at the beginning. Here's the model we'd like to reproduce there. And here's the result that we have. And we are lucky today. The projector is well calibrated, actually. So this is the result that we get. And a disclaimer, I won't be able to quantify how successful that is. But I hope we can all agree that the transformation I've shown you at least goes in the right direction. That this image is close, visually close in terms of style to the example we try to reproduce. And to show another example, so here's another picture. Again, that has this kind of interesting landscape. It's all kind of gray and not very exciting in terms of rendition. He's a totally different artist. So this one, it's all postcard. So this one is really a lot of global contrast. There's still this very dark, very bright region, but almost no details because it's all picture and the optics was not so good, so everything was a little bit blurry in these pictures. And we can produce that. Again, I won't be able to quantify how successful that is, but I think it does capture this notion of a lot of global contrast, but not a lot of texture, and we reproduce that. So that was the first attempt, and we're happy with that. And just after I work on this, I joined Adobe, and I work with the Photoshop team, so it's, okay. So it made it to Photoshop, so sorry. So that's the part that's a little bit tricky because I need to do it without looking at my screen, but okay, so that's even trickier than I thought it would be. But let's be strong. Oh, here, yeah, a bit better. But here it's very small. That's a different trend. But let's do that. And here's the screen is, I don't see as much. So no, I really need to look at here so I do something. So here what you've seen is the same thing except of doing it automatically with some histogram transfer. Photoshop users, they lack control. So we put sliders to just, and the sliders are just multiplication factors on the two layers that I've shown you before. So for instance, I can move this slider here to change the amount of local or global contrast. So for instance, here we go more and more global contrast. There's the shadows become darker, the highlight become darker, or here like much more uniform level there. And I can change here So for instance, I can say less details, less texture, or more texture, which is more local contrast. So to a first approximation, I think we all agree that it works, right? I can modify the image, and it modifies the statistics that we have discussed there. There's something that I quickly learned after joining Adobe, is that if we give sliders to users, they're not going to do what I've done. They're going to do that all the way to the end. That's guaranteed. People are going to do that. And so then that highlights, so that's really hard. That shows some problem. And the problem that we see here is that around the edges, we still see that kind of very strange kind of halos and double edges. This is what I told you. We do a lot better than a blur with this bilateral filter, but it's not perfect. And as I told you, once we have there, it's like a sticky paper. It's very hard to remove in the final result. So this result here are not so bad because it's still very useful if I don't go all the way to the end. But of course, photographers, they'd like to have more freedom, and they would like to go all the way and have more dramatic effect sometimes. Not all the time, but sometimes it's useful for them. So that motivated more work. So I'm going to show you how we address this problem. And that was really motivated by what we have seen here. So the idea is to have a better decomposition than this bilateral filter. And I'll go a bit more into detail of that one works. So first, I want to make sure we're on the same page. We're going to use Gaussian pyramid, which is really a very simple concept. We take an image reduced by a factor of 2, and we get a collection of images that are smaller and smaller and smaller there. Then we take the difference between two adjacent layers in this decomposition, and we get what we call the Laplacian pyramid. The Laplacian pyramid is a very nice representation because we get texture at different scale. We get very fine detail, medium scale detail, coarse scale details. The last thing is the residual, which is the last layer, the same as before, that captures the colors and the overall structure. So this is very simple, very fast to compute. It's image processing 101 in general. And pyramids have been around for long. People like them, very useful for things like compression, synthesis, a lot of things. But there was no proof, but there used to be a common belief in the communities that they're a bit too simple, like just resizing images and taking differences essentially is the same as blurring an image, so it's not good to deal with edges. And as we discussed earlier, if we blur, the results are not good, and we have halos and things of that nature. So there have been attempts to go closer there, but the conclusion were, it works with more advanced wavelet, but not with the standard Laplacian pyramid there. So we have done some work, and we have been able to show that, yes, we can actually use Laplacian pyramids to get that type of effect. And not only we can do it, but it's even better than other options that are out there. It's more robust, and that we can go all the way to the end of the slider, and I'll show you a bit of that later. So first, let me tell you how it works. So we have, the overall strategy is, let's do something that works on a small piece of the image and worry about the rest later. Then we'll do something, we'll find a smart way to combine all pieces of the image into one consistent filter, but for now we'll worry about a whole thing. What does that mean is, if I have that picture of a flower, it's too hard to process the whole image at once, but if I take that small piece of the flower, then I know what I want to do. If I want more detail there, I can do it, it's simple. And for instance, I can do it this way. I use this small S-shaped curve that takes every pixel. If it's brighter than the average, I make it even brighter. If it's darker than the average, I make it even darker. Very simple curve, apply the same curve to every pixel, give me what I want on that small part. Again, I apply that curve to the entire image. It's a very bad idea. There's some places it does the opposite effect, some places it does nothing. But it does what I want on that small piece that I'm looking at. So how can I extend that nice result on a small piece everywhere? A very simple approach would be, okay, I dice my image into small square, I do it every square, I put them side by side. It's not a surprise. Let's see how it looks on that video projector. So some video projector, okay. So this one is friendly there. It looks bad. Look here. On this projector, you can see here. You see the boundaries between the squares that we have cut. So it looks pretty bad. No one would like to have that. So we need to do a bit better than that. So what we propose is to have a multi-scale a multi-scale approach to resolve that problem. And what we're going to do, is to build a Laplacian pyramid of the output image, one coefficient at a time. So let me give you an illustration of how it works. So I have my input image, and I have the Laplacian pyramid of the output on one side, and we're going to compute the coefficient one at a time. So I take the first coefficient. I know this coefficient. I can backpropagate all the way to the bottom, correspond to a neighborhood in the image. I'm going to do my small curve that looks good for that neighborhood and only that neighborhood. I build a Laplacian pyramid just for that neighborhood. I get a full pyramid, and I copy one coefficient back there. Let's say that I have done a few more coefficients, so I'm a level below in the pyramid, correspond to a smaller neighborhood in the image. I applied my small transformation, build the pyramid, copy the coefficient there. If I go one level down, this time I have a very small neighborhood, I do a small transformation, do very small pyramid, I just copy one coefficient. We can discuss later how slow that is, and you're right, it's very slow. We can make it fast, and I'm happy to tell you, after the talk how to make it fast. But once I've done that, I can get a really good result. And trust me, this one is not the projector. It really looks good everywhere there. But I can change. So this is a curve that we apply, these small S-curves that make things a bit more contrasted locally. I can inverse my S-curves to make things less contrasted and remove detail. But then we experimented some more. If I want to do tone mapping, which is a problem of taking a high dynamic range image, which is too bright and too dark, I can again go for the simplest way to limit the dynamic range, which is thresholding. It's too bright, I cut. Too dark, I cut. But I do that locally, and that works also very well. So yeah, the projector, I think, give you a fairly good idea that we still see the results there. And come to see me after I can show you on the screen, it's even better than there. And I can combine these curves. So I can compress the dynamic range and enhance the detail by just combining the two curves together there. And so let me go back to Photoshop. So something is nice in Photoshop, which is there are different filters depending where you go. And so I open a different part of Photoshop. I'm happy to explain you where to find these different filters, where they are. Here's, so if I do, sorry, I need to, so let's make things a little bit brighter first, so we see there. But I can do, so highlights is just thresholding the brightest value. Shadows is thresholding the darkest value. There, so let me make things a little bit brighter. And the part that was hard to do earlier was, so clarity is Adobe speech for texture. So I can make less, but I can do more. And this time I can go all the way to the end, and let me zoom in. Okay, so this is the same place. Let me zoom out a bit. The same place we were earlier, if you remember, the tower and things like that. And it's much cleaner. You can argue it's not perfect, but it's a lot cleaner and it's much more robust. And this slider doesn't go very far, but I could do it and reapply it. It would still work well. Last year I had the chance to be in a PhD thesis nearby in a lab at, in ENS. And the student studied that, and he shows that it was one of the best performing filters. There, he found a way to compare that and show that indeed you can quantify that this works well. And that was a pleasant surprise for me there. But so we solved that problem. Now people can do more with Photoshop compared to before they were used to do before. Okay. So now we have a better way to manipulate images, so we can revisit this notion of style transfer. So here's the result we had with the previous decomposition. And this is a result, and I think we can argue that it captures the essence there. But if you look with the new decomposition, this is a lot closer. It's a lot richer in terms of details than what we had with the old one. And if we zoom into, this has become very clear, that the quality of the output is a lot better than what we had before. Even if the old algorithm works, the new algorithm works significantly better. So here I have two takeaway messages. That first is notion of style transfer, where we can adjust an image just by looking at another one that we like. it works. I think it's not obvious at first. Like now maybe I've shown you, it sounds obvious, but it's really not that. It was not clear before we started. And it's hard to decouple the high-level concept of I'm just showing an example and I just from the low-level part of what do I do with my pixels. It's important to do it the right thing with this pixel, otherwise we don't get good results. So at this point, there was a fairly natural extension to say, well, can I just learn? Not even as a user in the loop, give me an example. Can I do it from using machine learning? So we build a data set, and we have 5,000 photos, each of them retouched by a professional by hand. It took 3 months of work for a professional to do that, but you know, they did it, we pay them. And we used that in a machine algorithm, which is called Gaussian process regression. One interpretation of what it does is to select the most similar images in the training set, look at what professionals have done for these similar images, average them, and apply the average to the image. So it does something more advanced. I think it's a big simplification, but the essence of what's happening there. The nice part is that this one we can do more because we have some ground truth by professional. We can do a more quantitative validation. So we can compare what we predict to what an actual photographer would have done by just removing photos from the training set and testing against that. So it's not exactly the same, but you know, it's close enough there. And this one is an average, typical average error we have over like thousands of photos. That's about the average error we get. This one is better than average, but I think it still illustrates the kind of thing that it does around the eyes and all that. It does a pretty good job. So this algorithm is in Photoshop. If you do auto adjustment in Photoshop, that's exactly what I've shown you that happened. There's a data set of professional. Photoshop has data by professional, and every photo you call auto, it queries a data set and quickly gives you the result there. I know fewer people use Photoshop elements, but we can adapt this algorithm fairly easily to learn from users. So if you're not happy in Photoshop and keep editing, it will remember it and next time give you something that's really your version and not only a photographer that we hired at the beginning there. If we look at it, we step a step back. So this was before all the deep learning era, but still there's some advantages with that approach. Like first, we can learn with only a few hundred of examples. And it's critical because there are already 5,000 examples. We pay them, it was 3 months. Imagine if we needed millions of examples, I think it's not doable. Like, I think it's a very interesting problem to study how to do that with deep learning. It's not trivial how to do it first. So Gaussian process made it possible there. It's a very safe algorithm. If we throw at it an image never seen before, it will just reverse to the mean. It will not take risk. And again, that was critical with users. No Photoshop user wants their image to look all white or black or noise. That was important. It was easy to debug. Like we understand what Gaussian processes does. It minimizes an energy and all that. Compared to deep learning, it was a very comfortable setup in that perspective there. So we have done that, but we had some, when we work with that, we still had some things that was kind of itchy on the side, and I will show you what that was. The part we wanted to solve was portraits. Like this technique I've shown you before, it works extremely poorly on portraits. And this is Sunmin, the student at MIT at that time with whom I had the chance to work. She was nice enough to let us use her face as an example. I think we can all agree it's not really the most flattering rendition of her face there. So we wanted to do something specific for portraits. So we formulate the same type of problem. So it makes that portrait look like this other portrait by an artist. And we essentially use the same strategy, but we adapt it. Because portraits, there's a lot going on. There's different things. The texture of the skin is important, and the hair is important. So we essentially did the same algorithm, but instead of having just two scales, local and global contrast, we did a full multi-scale version of it. So first, we take the portraits, we decompose them into frequency bands. We do a transfer for each band where we copy the histogram of each of, we copy the statistic of each band, and then we collapse the result and get the output there. With this approach now, it works a lot better. So here's an example. What is nice there, again, there was no knowledge involved. It's that we just say, here's a photo, here's an artist, just go and do it. So that's a lot easier to use. Just by changing example, we can get a very different style there. And with another example, we can get a different style. This one I want to add a disclaimer that we do something special for the eyes. If you pay attention, we do copy the highlight in the eyes because some photographers go into great lengths to have special light that looks good in the eye, so we did something there. There's more than just what I've shown there. And something which it's fun, but I don't pretend that it's robust in any way, but we could push the algorithm to do video adjustment to show that it was still robust enough. But the one before, I think, is very robust. This is a bit more brittle. I would not try to use that on any video, but we're able to do that. Then we started to have other ideas. Say, OK, I can do example, but what if I use other than just an artist picture as example? And one application we found was to use time-lapse videos, because time-lapse videos, they show us the appearance of a given scene at any time of the day. So now, instead of having a single image retouched by an artist, we can use an example that shows us the appearance. So we can do something like this. I take this picture, and I can apply it. So this is at the beginning of the night or end of the afternoon. We can have it like right in the middle of the night. And this is all fake. This is not a real picture at night. And the more you look at it, the more you may be able to see problems. And maybe I'll tell you, before I switch to another picture, I'll show you where the problems are. But this is, compared to flying again back, I think this is Singapore. Instead of flying back, that gives a nice picture. Has anyone see where there are problems? I can tell you. So the highlight on the water, they really don't match the towers. If you look carefully, now that I tell you, it should be more obvious. So it's what we call an hallucination. It looks good at first, but once, if you pay attention, you can see inconsistencies there. Here's another example, where this is the middle of the day. Typical, not a time that photographers like a lot to take pictures. They prefer what's called golden hour, just before sunset, where the light is orange, and we can do a convincing rendition there. There's no motion of the shadows or anything like that, but at least the color tones are close to what it should be there. And we can do something else. If we can do it at one time of the day, we can do it at all the time of the day. And so this is a video I pre-rendered, but that illustrates what an interface could be. If I could get a slider that let me choose a time of day, where I could choose middle of the day, or at night, or deeper at night, or all the way to night. This all starts from a picture which is, I think, about there. I think that's the one photo, but now we can control, we can have a slider that we re-choose arbitrarily the time of the day where a scene looks like. And so it's not available in the product, but I think that would be a very powerful tool to have there. And we try to push it even farther. So the same idea, but this time with a starry night there, and we can see what if Van Gogh had done it. Sorry, I need to start. Yeah. Van Gogh had done it during a bit earlier in the day, or a bit later at night, or a pitch dark. So it's all hallucination, maybe less interesting on Van Gogh, but it's more proof that the algorithm is robust, that what we have done there is robust. And that's the same idea of using examples. So the last thing I'd like to show you there is, how do I go there? Like the modern version is using deep learning, and we were interested in that, of course, when we saw all the great work people have done there. The inspiration is the work by Léon Gatis, and you probably have heard about this work where he takes a photo, gives a painting as an example, and gets this great painterly rendition of photos. And if you have not seen that, it's amazing, it's great. And I had the chance to meet Léon Gatis in a workshop a bit like this one, and I was in the audience, and I asked him, like, does it work with photos? Like, what if I give you a photo, can you do it? Because I was very interested in that version of the story. And he told me, not really, like not there. So I went back home, and I tried, of course. And so it doesn't work very well, and it's a bit surprising. So that's so here you see that we give that picture of San Francisco, give it a photo at night. I think it's Chicago, and we get that. And it's kind of get it, but not quite, right? So there's two things that are a bit problematic. You can see this weird kind of color in the sky, and there's this window, something happened, right? The texture is all munched up there, so that's not good there. So if we go a bit more formally about what's going on there, there's what we call a semantic mismatch. Because if you look carefully at this texture there, is a texture of the light in the street. Somehow they end up floating in the sky for some reason. And I will explain why there. And there's also this unwanted distortion that happened there. In some sense, even if we don't want a painting, it still gives us a painting. And that's, in the work of photography, is not great. And if we look at how the algorithm by Léon Gattis works, there's something interesting there. Is that, from my perspective, of course, that's not how we describe it, but my perspective looked very much like everything we had done before. In the sense that first he takes the input and output images and runs them through a neural network, and this is the neural network that he uses. But we can call that a neural network, but if we squint our eyes, this is just a different pyramid. Like, it's really a different pyramid, it's just a multi-scale decomposition. It seems to be a very powerful one, but this is no different what I've shown you of portraits or landscape before. Then he imposed some of the statistics he learned from this decomposition on the output, and then he reconstructs the image. So I never retold you how I was reconstructing because I was just collapsing my frequency decomposition. In this case, he has to do a more advanced decomposition to invert the neural network, but it's essentially the same thing. It's going from statistics back to an image. So that looks very much like what we were doing before, but with different tools. And so we started to work on this. And the first thing that we did was to work on the reconstruction stage to try to remove this distortion there. So let me explain you a bit more what's going on there. So first I was really thinking it would be easy. I hired an intern and told him, you know what, in a month we're done. Like, I was so wrong. It didn't work. So we tried so many things, none of them really worked. So we tried to work the gradient domain. We said, okay, of course, multiscale is going to do it because it worked so well before when it didn't work. We tried to work in the frequency domain with Fourier transform, didn't work. It all helped a bit, but not that well. So at the end, we use a technique that has been proposed by Anat Levin formatting, which is to say the output image, every patch in the output image has to be expressed as a affine combination of the patch in the input image. And so that's really that simple equation that's expressed at every patch, and she derives the equation of what that means when this constraint applied to every patch and added over the whole image. So she does all the hard work of the decomposition, and that helps a lot. The idea there is that this prevents any distortion, because if an edge is located at a given place in the input image, since the output has to be a combination of the RG and B channels, well, the edge cannot move. It can be larger or smaller, but it can move left and right because it's located at a very specific place in the input channel. So once we do that, we do a big step forward. We go from this version that we saw that was all like jumbled up to things where we go back these nice things that are nicely aligned and everything there. So, but we still have these weird things that happen in the sky. So that was the next step. So then we went to look exactly what was going on with the statistics to understand a bit better. And Léon Gattis, the way he does it is that he takes the output of this neural network decomposition, he forms big vectors and he computes what's called the gram matrix of this big vector. And the gram matrix is nothing more than just the collection of all dot products between all vectors. Something fairly simple to compute. And he has a good explanation why it's a very good statistic, and that reason is that it does not depend on the pixel position. When we have done the dot product, the position has, we sum over the position, so we know the dot product, but it can be anywhere in the image. That's important because the model and the photos, they may be not in the different location, so things can move around in the image. That's an important property of this matrix. But it has another problem when I read a bit more, say, what do we know about the gram matrix? And I opened my math book, and it says that the gram matrix, if we know the gram matrix, we know the input vectors up to an isometry. And one consequence of that is that somehow the histogram is conserved. And by that, let me give you an intuition. If I look at my input image and my model, and I look roughly where the sky is, I have less sky in the models than I have in the input. So I don't have the same number of sky vector in the two images. And this is the reason we have these slides that float in the sky, is that basically during the transfer, we run out of sky vector, so we have to come from somewhere else, and for some reason, the algorithm finds that we have enough light vectors, and we move the light bulb vectors in the sky to fill in there. So that explains the reason. So once we understood that, the solution was fairly easy. So we run off-the-shelf semantic segmentation, and then we just transfer sky to sky, building to buildings, and things of that nature. So here's the kind of segmentation that we have. Does not need to be very precise, but now we see we have different quantities of sky and different kind of buildings. The blue go to blue, red go to red, and that solves the problem. So let me show you the result. So that was the original algorithm that with all the problem we discussed. This is after the affine transform, so we don't have distortion, but we still have lights in the sky. And this is with everything, where we constrain the sky to the sky and the building to the building. We have very clean result. Again, we started from there, and we got that. So it's a fairly dramatic, it's a very strong transformation. This is very hard. None of the algorithm I've shown you before would have been able to do that level of transform. That's this color change are really important. Then we tried on different things. So for instance, here, a Roman church. If we apply the, and we want to make it look like a Baroque version there, we apply the original algorithms, kind of work, but as all this messed up texture, we can produce that, which is a lot cleaner and still captures this kind of rich, colorful church. The next example, I agree, is too much. It's a stress case. It's going to be way too much color, but bear with me. So the original algorithm does get the color, but get all this distortion everywhere. We said, oh, if it's all about getting colors, I can do color transfer. So that color transfer, so color transfer looks pretty bad, but no distortion. The colors are really not good, and we can produce this. And we may argue that this is a way too colorful rendition of that image, but it's fairly close. I think it's much closer to the input. Here's something interesting we can see. There is a ground, like this kind of the land part is red. And this we now understand why. We have no ground in the example. So the algorithm just take other vector from somewhere else and put them here because there's no match. But that is something we need to improve. But at least it's explained in there. A natural question is that, oh, but how does it compare to this previous technique I've shown you? So here, for instance, on portraits, here what we can get. What is interesting, this result, we obtain it with the exact same result that we use for the church landscape, no change, same parameters, really no change whatsoever. But if we use a portrait-specific algorithm, I think we can all agree we still do a bit better. Like, it's really interesting, we can get results, but we don't quite match yet the qualities there. We did a user study to try to quantify this. So we look at, do we succeed at producing photorealistic output? The answer is yes, more than other algorithms that we have seen. There's no distortion. And then we compare, like, but do we also capture the style? And everyone, like, it's a subjective assessment, but the answer was overwhelming that yes, we do capture the style better than previous other things. So it's not yet ready to go in a product. It's really slow, like it's really slow. And the memory is way too big, so to give you a sense of the kind of problems that we need to look at. So what do we do, what do we need to do next? So we've just looked at one modification as algorithm where we modify the two-step. I think there's a lot more things that worth to be tried. There's some very interesting questions that are really itching me hard these days. Why does it work to use a neural network that has been trained? This VGG network, if you know about it, is that been trained to recognize dogs and cats. Why does it work at doing paintings or doing photographic style transfers? That's a mystery to me. To solve this problem of spillover of the sky, we run a full semantic segmentation to recognize the skies. That seems to be a way too big hammer for what we try to solve. It should be obvious there is light in the sky. We should not need to use something that complicated to do that. And why is there distortion at the first place? We, I think, succeed pretty well at removing it, but why does it happen? It should not be there. It was not in the photo. Like, why? Like, I'm glad we solved it, but it's not fully satisfying because I cannot tell you why it happened at the first place. And I think until we understand why it happened, we cannot be that useful. The other thing is that, as we discussed, I mean, there's a lot of examples of good photos and all that. Can we get rid of that example? And we have seen that with a previous technique, we were able to use Gaussian processes to do some of that. Can we give the same treatment that and revisit that work there? And I think there's been some really good work by people at Microsoft Asia, for instance, recently to do go there. Question, like, we have millions of photos out there. Can we do something with that? And I think it's really not a trivial question to do that. But there's some, for instance, good work going on at Berkeley to go there. But at the end, what I still believe is that it's possible to take photos that are nothing special like this one and do something great with them. Like that, or for instance, take picture where people try to sell their home, which is again a kind of grayish picture of a kitchen, and get something a lot more professional like that. It is doable. So to conclude, I think style transfer is a very simple and intuitive way to do it. Just say, no, I like that, make it happen. No sliders, no expertise required. I still think it raises a number of interesting questions. What is style? What is content? What are all these statistics that we might manipulate? What do they matter? We can show more. There's a lot of other applications once we have this idea. I hope that I gave you the bug to try other combination of example and input, but there. And of course, that would not be complete without acknowledging that I've shown you all this work. I've done very little of it in practice, all with my collaborators, interns, students who spend days and nights to actually make it work. So thank you very much.
So thank you very much for this very nice talk. Are there some questions in the audience?
Thank you for your talk. I have a simple question. When the images as artifacts like JPEG compression artifacts or noise, do you have a special care to deal with that?
So right now, we have more a hack than a solution. Is that we have a threshold things, signal variations are small. We can classify them as noise and we don't touch them. If we don't do that, the algorithm is going to be repeating, oh, some texture, and if the model has more texture, it's going to be very happy to increase it, and that looks terrible. As it works reasonably well. All the results I've shown you here have that solution, which is if the variations are small, we don't touch. But to enhance degraded images is a hard problem on its own, and we didn't try it there.
Are you familiar with Landon McCann? In the 80s, they were working on something which is called Retinex.
Yeah.
And in fact, they give reasoning behind the multi-scale pyramid and how to you actually blend between the bilateral and the multi-scale pyramid. I mean, there is a fundamental explanation for that.
I agree. One reason, you can see everything we do here can be seen as an approximation of the Retinex that separates the kind of content from the illumination, and all we do is, not everything, but a lot of what I've shown you is basically changing the light, right? The portrait is just to simulate the light in the studio, and we try to, it's an approximation of the illumination decomposition. My experience with the original algorithm is that the decomposition is not very robust, and that's the sticky, what I call the sticky paper problems. Then once we have a problem, once we have halos, they are hard to put back. But I agree, I could have given the same talk presenting all the explanation into let's try to approximate the illumination in the scene and to replace it by a different illumination. For instance, it's very clear of the time of day. Try to remove the afternoon light and put the sunset light. That's exactly what's going on there. I agree.
Thank you. Are there further questions?
At some point, you said we have to understand where does the distortion come from, but actually it's encoded in the statistics which are computed by the network. Why would you be surprised to see them repeated in the output unless you block them explicitly?
Because the photo didn't have, when we use this example, the photo does not have distortion. So I find it a bit surprising there's some distortion, because I use this photo from Chicago that has very straight building and square, grid-like window structure. And yet we produce something that has wavy windows. So this was the waviness of the window was not in the photo. So it's somewhere in the network. And I have some intuition that the network has these max pooling layers, meaning it takes 2 by 2 pixels and takes the largest response of the 2 by 2. So some more things can move and as far as these top layers know, there's an uncertainty about 2 by 2, but I'd like something a bit more formal to explain that, because if I was able to explain, maybe I can have a better network that does not that doesn't have this uncertainty. So I wouldn't have, because it's fairly heavy, this affine constraint I've shown. It's a pretty big matrix, which is sparse but not super sparse, so it's computationally expensive to impose that constraint. So it would be, I think, a more elegant, at least, solution would be to modify the network so that there's not this ambiguity in space. So if there's no distortion, we don't introduce it. there, so we don't have to force the lack of distortion in the output. Maybe if you know, I'm very curious to know better. Like for me, it's a bit of a mystery why we have a distortion where we don't have distortion in the model photo.
In your model, in the model, there was this oblique lines. They were all over the model. So this type of structure is, I guess, captured. It's not in the input, but it's in the style that you want to inherit from.
But there were still long lines. I know the things were slanted, but they are really slanted a long line. It may not be the right statistics. Maybe the statistics should be somehow rotationally invariant, and right now they are fixed in the rotation space, and they should not be fixed. I completely agree with you. There's some things there. I've shown you a solution, but I think if we understood better the origin of the problem, we would be able to do something like that, and that would be more satisfying and likely better looking and faster.
Okay, I think it's time to thank our speaker again. So if you want to keep the schedule, we'll move to the next speaker.